I'm Vince Goody from Canada, and I spend most of my waking hours customizing motorcycles, namely high-end hot rod choppers and low-slung baggers. It's difficult to describe how I approach mural work as a set formula or regimented attack, because every job is so vastly different. In this video, I offer a scenario I'm familiar with. It sounds like this. A customer comes to me and says he really likes his bike to be this color, but I want you to include this picture I found as a focal point to your design. Now you're faced with the problem of meshing the original reference artwork to the color harmony of the bike. So throughout this video, I'll explain how I meet this challenge. I'd also like to say at this point, most of the time my prelim sketches are loose and only serve as color studies or overall composition plans. I always let the magic happen on the tank. I never sweat it out in the initial stages. I just start painting, and pretty soon the creative side of me shows up for work, and then I can just sit back and enjoy myself. A lot of times when I'm done, I look at my creation and wonder, where did that come from? But at that point, I really know I got into it. So enough of the philosophy, let's just rip into it. Okay, first things first, before I start actually painting this tank or even talking about it, I want to thank Jesse James from West Coast Choppers. He donated this tank. That was cool, man. Thanks. Okay, because it's an advanced video, we're going to deal with mostly how I achieve a really tight graphic. We're not going to dwell on parts like prep and how I really arrived at all these different type graphics here. I'll briefly explain them, but really, if you need to know more information, check out the earlier videos. Vince Goody's complete guide on painting motorcycle tanks. Firstly, on this tank at the top, we had to mold in this section here with body filler, so it had a nice smooth kind of flow from the spout down. We filled in the top section, the face of this tank, so it was nice and straight, because when you get clear coat on there, it gets kind of wavy. We boxed in the bottom tunnel as well as along the sides, because there was wells that were like a really visible mess. So we just cleaned them up with body filler as well as on the bottom. And that gives it a nice, clean, almost one-piece plastic type appearance. You know, you can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear, so you might as well get this thing nice and straight before you start putting artwork on it. Okay, even though this is an advanced tape, I feel I should maybe explain how I achieve these graphics on this tank. This has been clear coated to knock down the edges of anywhere a ridge where the colors might have joined, and same with at the top. There's pieces where I've cut out with spray mask and there will be an edge there. So by putting clear coat on them, you're going to eliminate that edge when you sand it out. I'm going to show you a little technique here I use, and this will show you what it's going to look like when it's cleared. This is DX330. It's a wax and grease remover. You put it on there and bam, it pulls out everything, and that's what it's going to look like. So it's such a dramatic effect. I didn't want you to think it was a really gross looking piece before you even started watching me paint the rest of it. So that really gives you an idea what those graphics, those carved in type tribal things look like when it's cleared. Now the reason I did this is because I wanted to give the tank a feel of ancient ruins. So this guy gives you that feeling without getting too much into detail, because I want their eyes to be really drawn to the image I'm going to do on top. Okay, once again using the DX330, I'm going to wipe this down to give you an idea kind of how cool this texture is when it's going to be clear coated. I put these cracks in here to give me a starting point from where all my little creatures and fire is going to kind of stem from. It's always neat to have little different elements in your design in order to get people to look closer and closer so you can hide some details in there. How I achieved this is using spray mask, and if Spray Lat is the company that makes the spray mask, and what it is like a masking fluid that goes on top, dries, and you can cut it just like a frisket, but without all the problems of frisket. If you're not familiar with using Spray Lat, you can refer to some of my earlier videos, like the helmet video or the bowling pin video that has a great deal on how to use this product. Okay, in the particular project I'm working on now, the client is really me, but we're going to pretend it's something I would run through the same way if I had somebody come to my door and knock on the door. I chose this reference photo that I want to use for my piece, just like someone else would say, this is what I want. Then what I did is I ran through that and I drew up some similar kind of ghoulish guys, and this guy might go on the back fender, I don't know, you know, just stuff that I had in my head at the time when I was designing it. This guy might go somewhere, a study of his muscle, just stuff that I think about before I paint a bike, what kind of images I want to portray on the bike. In this particular sketch here, it's really, really rough, just like I said before, because I don't want to waste time sketching and sketching. This isn't what's going to make me money, it's what I'm doing on here that's going to make me money. So what I do here is I kind of think about what kind of colors I want to use, what kind of images I want to portray in the whole feel I'm actually trying to get, or flavor I want to get with the bike. Over here it's even more rough, but it just shows how your head works. If you think fast, you create fast, sometimes it's the best way to go. Okay, the first thing I did in order to achieve this sketch is I put 2 or 3 coats of white pearl, and the reason I do that, that gives me a lot of freedom in order to blend into the surrounding local colors, as well as it gives me a cleaner background in order to sketch on. And what I did is I took my original sketch, I used a light graphite pencil, and I just blocked out the main components. I don't get into detail here because you'll get marks you don't want to see later. And then what I did is I clear coated it over top in order to hide any kind of deviations where you're going to have your graphics. You'll have like a little lip there because there's going to be 2 or 3 layers of color that's going to make a bump. And you don't want to have that there because when you're painting, you're going to show up later. It's going to dig through when you sand. So get her all flat with clear, seal in the lead pencil, and sand her down with an 800 grit wet paper after you clear it. It's a urethane clear, and then you're ready to start airbrushing. Now in some cases, in jobs that are quite detailed or something like that, and the customer really doesn't have a feel for what you got in your head, to give them confidence, I'll do up a mock-up or something that's close to what I'm trying to achieve in the end. It also gives me confidence. It gives me an idea what I'm going to do with colors and how I'm going to counter light it or anything, like, various types of effects I want to achieve. And that way I'm not actually working on the finished piece. If I make a mistake or I have a change of heart halfway through as far as color and tone goes, I can just start again. So let's look at the piece, and I'll sort of tell you what I'm doing. Okay, now I remind you, this phase or this actual service I give to the client isn't free. I charge them for this just like I would on the tank, and they can retain this piece, or else if I specify before I do it that I want to retain this for my portfolio, I just lay it on the line, and 90% of the time they don't have a problem with it. They're so happy that you'd go this extra step, they're more than willing to oblige. This piece is far from finished, far from finished. It's just an idea of the darkest colors I'm going to use, perhaps, or what kind of type of tones I'm trying to achieve, and I guess it's just mainly just trying to figure out where you're going and giving the client an idea of the direction you're heading in. And the coolest part about when you do this, you kind of fire right into the job when you get to it, because you've got all that confidence behind you that you're on the right track. Both of them are happy, and it's a great service to provide for your client. Okay, I'm assuming you guys have been at this quite a while because you bought an advanced video, but I still feel obligated to mention respirator. I'm not going to wear it because usually I'd be sounding like throughout the video, so I'm going to not wear it, but I should be. Also, the sound you hear is the sound of the spray booth sucking away this toxic cloud that's going to form around me. So you got to have one of those when you're working. The main thing about my paint is reduction. I'm so into reduction, and I'm into correct mixtures that allows me to get that tight images that I do get. The first thing I'm going to show you here, the color we're going in with is a white. In this particular case, it's a global white. It's D753. It's reduced with probably a medium reducer by about 75, maybe 50 to 75%. You got to play with it because there's no real exact measurement. And the other thing I throw in is a bit of retarder. It's D8110. You only need a couple of drops, and that does the trick. So let's start painting. Okay, grab a tack rag, take off any junk that might have built up there by static or anything. Slightly give it a rub. For this project, I'm using a Micron C because it's a fairly big image. I might use a B when I get into smaller images, but this will work perfect for this. I've removed the cap because I like to see what's going on in there, and I've tossed the handle because I never ever use, but it's just easier to get access to it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to find an area that's not really that in your face, and I'm just going to test my mixture, see how it works. It's not doing too bad. If it starts to spit or load up on you, you know it's starting to get too fast a reduction, so you can always slow it down, knock it back a bit. My goal here is to build up shape, indicate where the light source is, and also start to define shapes and forms. So this mixture looks like it's going to start working pretty good. Keep an eye on your tip and just pick a place where you want to start. I'm judging the light's coming from here, so I'm going to start hitting the shoulder area. In some places where the light is directly hitting it, I start to form details already, like the sinew in the shoulders. And I use my reference photo all the time, sort of checking where things are coming from. Like I said, this is just an interpretation of the original sketch by Brahm. I don't want to try and do it verbatim. I just want to use his drawing because it's got such beautiful shape, form to it. And also, like I said, if there was a real customer involved, not just me, they'd be asking for this image. So I'm just going to keep working this. Now this is going to be a hot side, so it's okay to get a good edge on this and then bring it in and round it out. It's really about, at this point, I'm looking from a farther distance, and I'm going to work quite quickly because I don't want to spend all day spraying this white. I just want to keep building up forms. I'm quite far away right now. If you look at it, I'm probably 3-4 inches away, and I'm just building up the main mass areas of this body. So I notice down here is a shadow. What this does now, if I can explain, is that I've got a white pearl base behind there. What that is it's reflecting light all the time. This opaque white is going to cut that out, and what that's going to do is going to make this whole image pop forwards. And when I'm done, it's really effective because I'm going to use transparent colors behind. I'm going to use this opaque white, and then I'm going to build up transparent colors on top of this white. So what this really does is really provides almost like I'm building a canvas as I go on my image, because none of this light color is going to show later. Absolutely none of it. It's going to be all shades of different colors. So don't obliterate your lines. I should mention here, when you get to an edge, drop the pressure back, come in, and then even though this is going to be hair later, and I know it's going to be very dark, you got to have undertones and undercolors to show up later. A rule of thumb is always remember when you're painting, you got to have light to show dark, dark to show light. If you remember that, you're halfway home on any project or any kind of composition you're working on. Okay, I know this is going to be really dark later, so I'm not going to hit that too hard. This horn here is directly getting hit by light, so I start working that. You can even, you know, you can even just kind of build it up on the outside like this. Like I say, it's not really that critical at this point. What you're doing is just working in the form. We'll get shape and structure later. Right now I just want to work on the basic large shapes. And what I mean by that is a horn is basically a cylinder. So I'm trying to give the illusion of a cylinder, even though it's very barbaric and rough right now. So you can hop around, you don't have to stay in one place. I know this is going to be a bicep. I know there's a shadow here later, but you really got to get rid of that pearl. It's going to shine through later. So cover up all the areas. It's a slow process, it takes time. High-end custom paint takes time. There's no way to rush it. You got to take your time. If you get sloppy, you start getting loose, and that reflects later. Everybody's seen those murals. I call them blurls, because they're not tight. They're blurry. By the time this thing's done, you want to make it look like it can get up and walk off the page, poke you in the eye, and go back on there. Now in the face area, same thing. You're just building up pigment, and you still want to be able to see those pencil sketches or marks in there, the reference marks. If you look really closely at this, I mean, it looks like a grade 2 kid drew it. If you get close in there, it doesn't matter. That only shows you where things are going to go. It doesn't matter about how detailed it is. A lot of guys will get right detailed in there, and you know what? Half the time you change it by the time you're halfway through the piece because you've covered it up, or you've added a shadow here, or you've kind of created your own deal as you went along. So I'm going to continue on working on with this white and building up tones, keeping in mind where the light source is going to come. And as you get close to the edges, always remember, you got to keep it tight, and you're going to get some overspray, but that's okay. Reason being is we're going to cover that up later with different techniques that I have, and also you have background colors. I'm going to have to create an environment for this guy to live. I know this arm's going to be very dark, so dark to show light, light to show dark. So I need some light tones behind here. So what's going to be behind here? I don't know, maybe there's going to be a flame, man. Maybe there's going to be a face or spirits flying out of here, but I know I need this white. I know it has to be a light color, so it doesn't matter. I'm just going to build that up. Don't worry about going crossing over here because you're going to put a dark tone in there later, so it doesn't really matter. Don't waste time making things tight that don't have to be tight, but make sure that you do make things tight that have to be tight. I know it sounds kind of vague, but if you're thinking while you're painting, it makes a lot of sense. These murals take a long time as it is, so you might as well find ways to speed it up without jeopardizing any quality. I love these little monster guys because they just sort of pop out of nowhere, man. You can just play with them, give it some eye sockets, maybe a cheekbone, stretch them out, doesn't matter. Maybe some mouth maybe there screaming. And we'll capitalize on that later. That's just a rough sketch in there. So if you look at your sketch again, you find out where very bright parts are going to be, and you build up that color again, because you're going to punch that out later. The dark's going to knock that whole area right back. Leg comes down, so here's another area. So basically you're sort of sketching right now, almost loosely with the white, but you're also not forgetting to tighten up in areas that you need to tighten up in. Now this is the way I do it. I mean, there's a million variations the way you want to do it. I'm just showing you how I approach this, and sometimes it's completely different. Sometimes I'll work the opposite way. I'll have a really light background and I'll start hitting the darks first, depending if I want it to be a low-key drawing or a high-key drawing. Okay, I know this is going to be brighter here, so I'm going to start laying this in a little more. I know the light's going to hit from here. When I first started this, I thought I was kind of concerned about overspray, and I'd be sucking back 100 gallons of it here. But this machine that we have here today is working really good. Aerograph makes it, and man, does it ever pull away the overspray. I'm really surprised. Okay, so I'm going to continue working this white, and I'll show you what I come up with in a little while. Okay, I'm going to develop the face. It's such a focal point. I'm going to almost paint this white as if it was a finished piece. It could be a finished piece because it's going to be really focal. I like to work my murals from the eyes out as far as detail goes. The farther away I get, it's almost like a sketch. As I get out towards the wings, it'll almost be fading away to nothing. So I know the light's going to hit a brow here. So when I'm painting with the white, I don't really particularly try and do one clean line. I do a series of strokes. And that allows me to start developing direction and feel and texture in the face. I'm always adding small lines to suggest which direction each little form I'm trying to build up. And then later you can come in and enhance those little shapes and forms. I like to think of light as water, where it's going to hit, where it's going to end up, where it spills over. I know it's going to hit this corner of this horn really heavily, so I start working that. Sometimes if you want to keep your fingers steady, you can put your baby finger on your opposite hand. And if you're really working a really tight area, you can just kind of do that kind of deal. You know what I mean? Hold it there and just kind of keep that one little area tight. I know it's going to be some light reflecting from the bottom of that horn, so I catch that, play it up. Okay, I know there's a cheekbone here, play that up. There's an underpiece here. A lot of time your undertones and your white set the stage to where your textures are going to flow from, because they automatically give you light and dark areas that you can play up later. The main thing is sort of to connect them together. Once you get these little interplays of light, go back, sort of fade them out a little bit so that you still have a white area in the valleys. That way that pearl won't show through. It's not the end of the world if it shows through. You can knock it back with some other darker tones later. This jaw muscle. Another way to do it is to think of the overall shape of what you're trying to develop from a distance and then starting to tighten it up. As you get closer, your lines become tighter. There's a lot of air going on here, not a ton of paint. That's the reason for the reducer that's slow and the retarder. I've heard some guys whine to me that too much reducer, over-reduced, it's not going to have pigment, it's not going to bind. I've never had a mural fly off a bike. That kind of stuff they're talking about is sometimes from a paint rep that says they're following the rules in the book, and that works fine for overall application, but we're not painting an entire car with our airbrush. We're painting small little layers, and they're binding just fine. Take a look back, don't get too freaked out and get right in there for too long. Might scare yourself. Come back out, even up the tones. If you got a little bit of white overspray in there, it allows you to deal with it later and put colored shadows in there rather than just super dark, obliterating type shadows. You put actual color shadows. Okay, the light's going to come across. It's going to hit this mandible, the upper mandible of the face. We're going to deal with that more with the darker tones, but I still want to set the shape up. So keep building it up. Once again, I go back into my external environment here. So I know I have to have this as a dark area. So like I said before, I build it up with a lighter tone. Might look like it's all starting to gel together here. It doesn't matter, because that's going to come out later as we build up the dark tones. And this will give us a way to build color dynamics away from your image. My overall plan is going to be to make this lighter as it gets closer to the image, and then darker and fade into the tones of the overall golden type candy that this bike is, a brownish golden kind of color. So you don't have to make them too crazy, just get in there and fill up some space. Same with this hair, it's going to be dark, so I'm going to start laying in that contrasting tone. Now his wing, I'm just going to sort of fade it off into Nowhereville. It's a good way to end a mural sometimes. Rather than try and do the entire piece, wrap it around. You can just sort of fade it away because we want the overall impact to be on top of this bike. Now this wing, I think I'm gonna put some shape into it, some texture. And I'll play up on this stuff later. Top edge I want to keep tight. A lot of times when I'm painting, I get this close, especially later stages in the detail stages, you might hear me exhale with great force. That means I was holding my breath. Don't be alarmed. I'm not having a stroke or anything. It's just that I'm just concentrating. Everybody's got their habits. That's one I've got. Okay, and to continue working on the jaw area, this entire piece probably looks pretty blurry and out of focus right now. That's cool because, like I said before, you're just developing form and you're trying to get rid of that white pearl. Another method I've used before is just to start in with the white pearl, but it's not really the effect I want here. I want this sort of to jump out, and in the end I want it to be kind of a really hot kind of situation where he's kind of brimstone and fire and your classic bad guy. You know, you take a reference photo from somebody they want to get done on their bikes or whatever they want painted, and you start painting it, and it starts off almost like an image that someone else did, which they created, and which they did. They started the structure drawing, and they thought of it, but as time progresses, it takes on a life of its own that you've given it. And usually 9 times out of 10 you look at it, they're similar, but all the little nuances and textures that you put in there with the airbrush as opposed to a paintbrush are really quite dissimilar. So you should never really feel like, oh, I just copied that one, because you're the one that gave it the soul, you know, in your own way. And you made your customer happy because you got the image he wanted. All this stuff's going to tighten up later. Now, even with that slow mixture, my brush is starting to load up. If I get carried away with my thumbnail and start ripping at that needle, I know I'm gonna wreck it. So what I do is I just take my old paintbrush with a little bit of thinner on there and just give her a little white. And it's nice and gentle, you're not gonna wreck anything. Now, make sure you always get rid of that little drip that's gonna form. Give her some air and then you won't get any spitting. And you can get back at her with a clean tip. When you're making pointy stuff, it's always cool to go, just tilt your airbrush in the direction of where you want that point to end up. Now, I know there's gonna be a tongue in there somewhere. I don't really see it too much in the picture, but I want to put one in there. And then the light's going to sort of hit the inner side of that. If you ever need to make a tight line, just grab a loose template, nail it if you want. That's one way to do it. Now, continue your shapes. Don't get too wrapped to working up in one area. If you get tired of being really tight, just get into a different neighborhood. Just kind of work in there for a while so you sort of give your hands a stretch, your eyes a stretch, and then you can get back into some more detail after. I think the main thing when you're painting, once you get all the technical side away, is that it's a huge reflection on the mood you're in while you're painting. If you're in there all tight and freaking out, it's going to look stagnant. It's going to look that way. If you start just to let it happen, you know, and everything's fixable. It's always fixable. You can't ruin it. A lot of times, even like with this clear coat on here, the purpose I told you before is when I put this clear coat on was to level things out, give me an even canvas to work on. But if you're ever working on something that's new or a technique that you haven't perfected yet, but you really want to try it, you can put a layer of clear coat on. And if this really messes up beyond recognition, you just take some wet sandpaper, you can knock it down. 9 times out of 10, you can get that back to, as long as you have enough urethane clear on there, you can get it back to a point where you can start over again. You can always take thinners too and wipe it, but I don't really like doing that because it can really soften up your urethanes. So sometimes when doing these little kind of ghouly guys, you might just see something pop out at you. Like here, there's kind of a swoopy thing that might work out good as an eye. You can elaborate on that later. Okay, so that's how I got the face. That's about as far as you need to go as far as detail on the face. I'm going to work into the horn, and I continue on the rest of the body, and then we can start working, pulling out some detail in darker tones. Okay, as you can see, I've continued modeling this white image, and basically what I'm doing is trying to create a canvas to work from. It's almost like reverse. I'm building up almost like a negative image of what I'm going to do, and then I'm going to come in back in with a mid-tone and start carving it out. But I'm going to continue with this white. I'm going to show you basically some more work I'm going to do in the hand and maybe some in this rocky section. If it's rock when I get there, it is now in my head, but maybe I'll change my mind. That's a cool thing you can do. So same as before, basically almost like when you're doing in art school a mass study, you're not concerned with the small details, you're concerned with where the light's hitting the large masses, and you're gonna play those up later. So it's really just a suggestion of bone under the skin, continue to play it up later. I like to start off fairly loose and then continue building it up. Once again, you fill in any of that reflective white pearl here to a certain degree. In the dark shadows, the other color is going to take care of that job for you, but don't leave it too skeletal. We're working with flesh over bone. We're not just doing a skeleton dude here, so. Now, always when I'm working forearms or calf areas or wrists, I like to use these long strokes, and I like to develop some real direction to suggest ligaments. Even when you're using the same technique, you can use it in musculature, create striations. Even though they're very lightly formed at this stage, they give you areas to play off of later. So just interpret what you see. That's pretty well all I need to do there in order to dig that out later with some darker colors. Now, keeping in mind where the light's hitting, I'm going to play with some of this stuff here. I'm not sure what it's going to be later. Maybe it's just some kind of texture, but it could be a rock. So that's the side that's hitting the light. Start seeing little white spots happening. That means your tip's dirty. Any overspray, it's going to disappear here later. So just like in the upper figure drawing, continue just creating impressions of what's going on down here later. This whole area is going to be in overlap with flames and swirling type wraith-like beings. So it's not really that imperative to go crazy here, but you need to show some light here so I can drop a shadow, give this guy a place to live. This structure is going to be mainly dark or darker tones than the rest because I want it to stand out against a lighter flame background. But you're still going to have a little bit underpainting in here. Overspray control can be easily eliminated by just keep turning airbrush away from the way you want the overspray to disappear. This is all freehand stuff. I mean, you can always use templates. You can use whatever you like, whatever you've developed over time. If you want it to be really technical and real tight, you might want to do it if you're doing something that's like steel. But I find for like an organic type substances, this freehand stuff, if you're real tight with it, it's much more convincing. Sometimes you'll see guys using templates for rocks and mountains, and a lot of times they look almost too contrived. I've sketched in a bony little cat right here. Light's coming from here. Boom. The mixture that I'm using here right now is fairly slow and thin, but like I said, it's probably 50 to 75%. But compared to the stuff I'm going to be using when I'm doing the really tight detail stuff later, this is like syrup. The biggest thing to me about getting detail is pressure versus viscosity and speed of your reducer. A lot of times it's not really a set formula. You're going to have to adjust it throughout your painting process. I find even in the summertime, when I start painting early in the morning and then as the day rolls on, I've got to readjust it because of the heat difference. And then as the evening approaches, I got to play with it some more just to get it back to where it was earlier. That's all you really need for that, because you're going to use the other colors to dig him out. I think at this point I'm going to retire the white for a while and start stepping into some detailing with some local colors and some midtones. Okay, I've spun together a mixture. It's almost like an earthy tone. It's slightly redder than my original study because I wanted to adjust that to get it a bit more hot. Basically, it's like an organic maroon color with a couple of drops of green, a couple of drops of, maybe a little more than a couple of drops, maybe 15 drops of purple. And that kind of comes up with the kind of color you're going to see right now. I'm finished my white underpainting, so I'm ready to go. I've got a real nice bright white canvas to pick this guy out of. The first thing I'm going to do, because I know this area is going to be very dark to my reference photo, I can come in here and sort of test the waters and see where we're at, okay? Now it's very important when we start doing these undertones that you start keeping things tight now and keep all your details like you want it to look like in the end, because you start getting sloppy now, it's going to be a sloppy piece later. If you want to get a real tight kind of edge where you're going to have a shadowed area, let's say in the chest and abdomen, I know that's going to be right here. I want it to be a tight edge, so I'm going to start building up shadows in here. These are going to appear to be a reddish color right now, but as we start to go in and drop colors in later on, these guys are going to completely change. But you need these lighter colors even in the shadows so we can have a little bit of interplay in there. You don't want just a big black blob in there. So since I want these to be tight lines later, I'm going to make them tight lines now. You always got to remember that. It's almost like a real sharp edge against the contrast in color in the background. Like I say, this stencil I made myself. And really, it's just something to stop paint from going over there. And you don't have to go crazy and just worry about everything. Just, start building up the shapes as you get in there. Now, don't go too crazy with this technique. The only reason we're using it is so we keep that sharp edge. You wouldn't want to do the whole area like that. It's good to have some smooth transitions and also have some sharp edges. Out here, I might go just freehand. I don't know yet. Like I said, a lot of times I don't know what I'm doing until I actually get there. Now, this mixture, we're going to test it out and see how it works on detailed areas. So I usually pick out some dark areas because then you have some room for error if it starts to look too funky or weird. You can let this be loose in here because it's going to be a rounded area. And as we bring the darker tones in later, we'll tighten up that shadow. Gradual progression. Starting to build up a little bit. I think it's a little bit too fast still. I'm going to grab some of my D8110 retarder, not too much, maybe 3 or 4 drops in there. It's going to drastically change the way this reacts. Now, sometimes it gets to be really slow moving. That's okay. It's part of the deal. That gives you tons of control, tons of room. Paint this thing like it's going to be one color, and this is your last color you're going to use. Don't think, uh-oh, I made a mistake, because you can always fool around with it later and fix it up. By starting in the shadow areas, for me anyways, it gives me an idea exactly how dark this tone starts to go before it starts to load up and get splotchy or overwork the pigment. Like I'd say right there is about as much coverage I'd want to do on a large area. Now I know that's the darkest I want to achieve with this particular color I'm using. And later I'm going to come in here with a darker tone, knock that back even more. Even at this point, you can start adding a little bit of detail. So as I'm going here, I'm looking at it, making sure I don't overwork one area, but in the same time, I want to start adding details. Like even in this muscle here, you can start just adding some striations. Strange little textures and shape that make everything look so good in the end. I like to think of when I'm airbrushing, it's a series of strokes, like I probably mentioned it before, rather than one solid trying to like I'm pinstriping. It's rather just following a curve, enhancing it. It's nothing like it when your gun's working good and you're free to create. It's really worth it if your gun's starting to be a little finicky and give you any grief to stop, even though you might have a deadline. Stop, address the problem, and then continue on. So it gives you an idea of this area. I think I'm gonna go up and start playing around in the face area, because I like to start there. If I get a good evil looking face, it gives me inspiration to carry on at the rest. I see a sharp edge I like to get right here. That's good. As I get into these really tight things, I apologize if I'm not talking, but it's really hard to talk when you're not even breathing. So you just have to bear with me. Now, around the eye area, I really like to take my time and get the detail right now. It's really easy to overwork a super detailed area. Now you can see with the transparent color that I'm using, I can get a great degree of different colors in here. From a very organic, almost a maroon orangey color, to a darker reddish, almost a bloody tone, which is really exactly what I wanted to achieve, even more so than my original study. I find it helps you always throw in a couple of lines or shapes that enhance the form that you're trying to create. Here on the bridge of the eye, the eyebrow, you throw in a couple of hook shapes. It's pretty cool. In these type of areas, it's not unusual to spend large amounts of time. I suggest that you take the time, especially in the face regions, where people are going to look at it and have to really look into the soul of the beast that you're trying to create. If you blow it here, the rest of the thing is useless. It's a waste of time. So take your time, even if you got to take a couple of breaks. Everybody's got deadlines, but you really fall behind when you got to do something over. Right now I'm looking at the reference photo, I'm looking at how he did it, and then I'm sort of just interpreting the way I would see it. I'm not trying to look at it and go, oh, that's a line there, that's a line there. I'm just looking at the basic structure and then interpreting on my own what I think it would look like in my opinion. Always keeping in mind your light source. If that's not detailed enough for you, throw some more detail in, even smaller. Into the bone, little holes, little lines, cracks. Dark to show light, light to show dark against the horn going in front. As it comes in front, boom, it pushes that out. Don't forget the reflective light at the bottom of the horn. This guy might not have shaved today. I think it's just another element that's cool. I can make it interact with maybe the heat that's rising. Oh yeah, nothing like it when it's working right. Let's get into some of this nose, see what's gonna happen there. I want to give it a real attitude, a real angular type of snarl. That's going to underpaint color of the hair to sort of give me an idea of what's going to be. I'm not going to get into it too heavily because I won't be able to achieve any kind of real effectiveness with this color here. So I'm just going to build it up to the right shape really, and then that's about it. Now on the other side of the face, it appears a little red. That's where the other shadow is going to be. So when we start hitting this with some darker tones, that's going to look just groovy. Starting to get an attitude now. start pulling out that cheek area. Slowly build your tones up. Take a peek. And as you go, you'll correct anything doesn't look right. Keep in mind, think of where the shadows are. Think of the values of the shadows as you're going. Maybe perhaps the deepest shadows in the neck area where the light's being blocked is similar to the shadows in the eyes where they're being blocked as similar to the down here, so it's all balanced. So as you complete one section, you'll basically teach yourself how the rest is going to form. So by doing the face in extreme detail and almost finishing it, the rest of the mural you've already kind of eliminated figuring on what kind of tones you're going to go. So this demonstrates with one color how many variables you can get in shadow. So it's endless the amounts of nuances you can put into a face by simply adjusting this color to a cooler or to a lighter side or a warmer side and bringing up highlights. It's a really cool way back and forth, give and take until you get exactly where you want to be. Actually, in some pieces, I'll just continue using this one color, and it's quite an effective way to do a mural. Especially if you're going to put some candy over top, then you don't get that big ugly, if you work in blacks a lot of times and you cover it with a candy, it really just kind of, like, to me, black really kills everything. It's like putting a roadblock up in the middle of your picture. It just stands right out. So if you start lighter in your design, it gives you the option of using darker tones of your original color to be the shadows rather than, boom, a big chunk of black. The big detail work like this, nothing wrong with resting your hand and just kind of working with small areas, using other things to sort of stabilize what you're doing. I'm gonna give this guy a missing tooth just because I can. Now, the pressure I'm using here is very low. I couldn't tell you exactly what the pressure is. I kind of go by the sound. My regulator is set at 40 pounds, really. But I adjust it with the amount of pressure I'm putting on the trigger. In this method, I get an extreme variable in pressures. I can blow out the junk that builds up on the tip here and then continue back in with some detail work. And I can also lay down gradients without having a spitting or a sandy appearance that you see if you're working at too low a pressure and you're trying to lay down shadows or very subtle gradient tones. So at 40 pounds on the reg, I can go from pinpoint accuracy to very nice, smooth gradients, which saves you a ton of time. Sometimes when you're working really tight details like that, leave out little areas that are gonna get confusing. Like if I kept going with a perfect row of teeth through here, I'd lose how nice that one sticks out. You know what I'm saying? If I put another one right in there, it'd be kind of a clumpy mess. By darkening up in this area, I can pull these teeth forward. But if I did it to the tips here, they disappear. So I can darken these teeth up to the point where the tips emerge, and I can darken up the upper inside of his mouth, and it'll still be an effective way to pull those teeth forward. But if I start filling in here too heavy, I'm gonna lose all of them. Sometimes the suggestion is stronger than extreme detail in an area like inside of his mouth. We'll come back in here later and really tighten that up with another bunch of color. You might even have a little coming out of there. Little, I guess that's a new word. Okay, I'm bored playing in his face now. I'm done with that. I gotta move on because I'm getting bored here. Okay, now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start laying in some colors into my shadow areas. That way I'm gonna feel like I'm getting something accomplished here. I like jumping around. I like to compare values of colors. I wanna see where I'm gonna go with my next color. So the whole time I'm thinking about my next step, just like chess. So I know all this has to be a certain tone, so I'm gonna start working it in. I'm gonna start bringing in together all these elements. Because in shadow, you still have reflective light, and you got all kinds of things going on in there. You've got to have some degree of detail in there, but it's more vague. So sometimes what I do is I'll try and lay down a fairly uniform color to a certain degree, making sure I don't get too dark. You can always darken it up, but it's difficult to sort of go backwards. So I know all this area has to be in shadow. It's going to be in shadow here, this is going to be in shadow here, and then the bottom of this chest is shadow, and so is his shoulder. But I'm not going to get into that area too much right now. So I gradually, very gradually start building up these shapes and tones. Constantly referring to where I'm going with the rest of this piece. I find the darkest point, my reference, and I start to work that, and then I'll compare everything else to it. Okay, so I'm gonna keep working in the darkest area first, so I have something to compare the rest to, and I'll just start building up the shapes I want to achieve. I like to leave a little reflective light on the bottom of that pectoral muscle there, because that's going to be the only thing left in the dark really to show where that came from, or what define its shape against the bicep down here. It's going to end up being quite a bit darker near the end of the project, but for now I'm going to keep it around where it's at, build it up slowly. Keep your edges tight. Always create ways of pushing light areas out so that they stand away from the dark areas. Just like we're using in the white, the same technique. In the shadows, I just build up form again. Later on, we'll go in, maybe texture it a bit more, or deal with it a little bit more detail, but really, we're more concerned about how this color relates to the rest overall. Try and think of big shapes sometimes as well. Don't get too stickled in on the fine details. I know I want that shoulder to come out, so I'm going to remind myself of that right now before I get too involved. Now in these darker areas, we're going to come back in here with probably the same color, maybe with a bit of its complement added, and maybe a drop of purple or something to darken it up. So mainly, just keep knocking it back and looking at it, how it looks with the interplay of light here. Now as the hand goes down, I want to fade away in the details, so I'm not going to get really tight into the finger areas, because they're going to be behind flames and other things, so I'm just going to suggest that for now. I'm not going to get too carried away. But as I get up the hand, I get tighter and tighter. So it's loose and then tight. Sometimes don't be afraid to look at your own anatomy to kind of help you out, figure out where the masses are. Okay, we're going to knock this back. Now we're going to have a shadow in here. I was going to use this local color for now, because it doesn't matter, I can come back in here later and change that slightly to a more cooler cast. I'm just sort of sketching it in. This whole area is going to have some action going on later on, so I don't want to get too carried away. Little details where maybe a vein is crossing over on the inside of the forearm might be a nice touch. Use your own judgment. Anything you feel will add to the overall look of your design, go for it. I'm going to start carving away at the shoulder here. A large mass, pretty well right into the light area. It's going to catch a lot of light. I like things to connect to a certain degree. They flow together. When you make one stroke, sometimes just make it go in the general direction of another area of the muscle mass. Just tends to give it a bit more dynamics. You see me jumping around sometimes, that's just trying to keep things balanced as far as the colors I'm using. If I stick in one area all the time, you're going to get kind of mesmerized by what you're doing. So it's just kind of find areas that you'd like to work that are similar in color, like boom, boom. Then you know you're balanced, because those shadows are pretty close in my books here for what I'm trying to achieve. In the wing area, I'm going to give it sort of a mottled kind of lumpy texture. So to achieve that, I kind of do some free association kind of drawing here, and then I'll elaborate on the different shapes that I've kind of made. That sort of pop up all by themselves. It's like when you're drawing clouds or something. But we'll make this look more like a rounded mass when we get to it. There's quite a bit of light hitting on this area here, so I want to keep that fairly a lot of that white showing through from before, and play up the fact that it's round, but I also want to make it look like it's connected into the latissimus, like the dorsi muscle here. Latissimus dorsi. Back muscle, I guess. Okay. Sometimes if you're painting, come into work one morning and you're a little tight and you feel like it's going to be difficult to get into what you're doing. Like I said before, just start. Just start painting. Don't get into this thing where you gotta, I'm not into it. I'm not in the mood. I need my latte. I'm not in the mood. Just start painting, and sooner or later, like I said before, your creative side will show up, and then bang, you start to rock. Once you listen to a bit of music or whatever you do in your shop, not everybody's right on the ball first thing in the morning or sometimes in the day. So I find, anyways, for me, I just start going, and then eventually, as you warm up, you can start to feel that side of you that's going to start having some fun, which it should be. It reflects in your piece completely. These are those strokes I was talking about, interconnecting the ligaments. Even though you're looking at a reference piece, you can kind of put your own stuff in there as long as you're dealing with the anatomy. If you don't know anatomy, you should maybe take a course or read a book, and you can sort of play up things. These might not show unless you're extremely very thin-skinned, or even in this case, if there's, because it's a fantasy piece, you can elaborate on the fact that there are these little ligaments and small joints that actually join the muscle to the bone. Now, if you've seen the average dude walking down the street with stuff like this hanging out, that'd be a good time for you to probably split. But in a case like this, in a fantasy painting, it's all really what you want to do. It just adds to the overall creepiness or surrealism of it. So continue on building your shapes and working them. This arm's going to pop out more as I start to add some dark tones behind it, but right now, try and keep it fairly light. Now, as the muscles come into the forearm, they can converge into tendons. In this piece, the reference photo, it's fairly laid back. It's not very detailed. So I'm gonna add my own kind of life to it. Sometimes I find in ligaments, you give them a little pattern that goes around the rounded surface, and it makes it look like it just suggests the shape of what you're trying to portray. And other times, not at the risk of simplifying things, just do stuff that looks right. If it looks right to you, just put it in there. It doesn't have to be a perfect anatomical study. Someone might come to you and say, well, that doesn't have exactly the right shape to the lower arm muscle. You'd say, well, the guy has horns coming out of his head, and he's got a giant gaping maw and protuberances hanging off his head. That doesn't happen usually either. So as long as it's believable to a point, it's good. It has to stick sort of to the rules, but you also have to bend them a little bit in order to give it that little extra value, a little shock value. I have a confession to make. I'm a texture addict. I can't get enough texture in any of my paintings. I love it. I find it exciting. It's good for the eyes. People look at it, and when they see different types of textures, it adds to the overall dynamics of the piece. So I've come up with different ways to make texture over the years. This particular little piece here is something that I've cut out that will be available to buy in the near future. So I'm going to show you how I use this to make different types of textures. I'm going to go into the arm area, and I just lightly spray it, very lightly, on the top edges, and it gives me this almost indented, cool look. To me, it's neat to have stuff like that in there, because people look and go, how do you do that, you know? Even though most guys like, you know, yourself would probably know how it was pulled off, but the average client, to them, it's just another dimension to your piece. It's like eye candy, you know? Sometimes if you pick your texture right and make it flow with the curve of things, it enhances the shape as well. It's almost like, you know, he's got a little bit of funky skin happening here. One thing I'll tell you though, don't, unless you really want to do it, don't put the same texture over and over again. Then it looks, you know, too much like you're repeating yourself. You're repeating yourself. You're repeating yourself. So once again, keep in mind where the light's coming from. In the lighter areas, it's gonna show up more, so you don't have to lay so much on. But in the darker areas, you know, it's like saying here, hit it a little harder. But sometimes just even that much is enough. Maybe in this little area, I'll throw a couple of little chunks in there. Very little paint. If you go too much, it's really easy to go overboard with these things. I use this a lot of times when I'm doing rock or anything that needs erratic shapes, but you have a lot of control. And you know, like from your earlier lessons with shields, you know, you can hold it away, get a different type of shape, hold it tight to it, you can move it while you're spraying to get a softer kind of edge. All that stuff applies. See how that kind of gives it a neat look? You could use it in the rock, you could use it anywhere you want. Okay, one of the things I like to do in murals is always focus your eyes to the center, details in the center. And as you go out, like in this wing area, I'm going to slowly lose the density, and it's gonna just kind of fade away. But as it gets closer, you need to keep the detail up. Just like when you see a sketch or when you're doing sketches in life drawing classes, you know, you concentrate on the center, and then the rest, you just develop the piece in the center, and the rest kind of just fades away. And that gives it a good way to end your mural and keep your eyes towards the center. We're going to come in here later with a little bit of transparent colors to marry these colors all together here. Okay, so there's the top of the wing. Remember, this is in a very lit area. You know, I imagine the surface of his skin might have a few imperfections, so I play them up. It also gives your mural an illusion of a lot more detail and tightness when you have these little tight type of shapes. Now as it goes away, I'm going to darken it. See how that sort of fades off into the background now. I want to keep this fairly light because I'm going to have really dark hair coming up here, or darker tones of the hair, so it'll really contrast against there. It's the same old story all throughout the whole piece, or anything in pieces you do. It's the basic laws that you have to stick to, and that's light to show dark, dark to show light. It's probably the one I always remember the most because it really helps make your piece have some dynamics. Now remember, as this rolls over, you're going to have a shadow, but if I'm telling you stuff you already know, then, you know, forgive me. But if I didn't tell you, I won't get my paycheck. Okay, so that's his wing taken off there. Once the hair goes there, it'll knock that back. I'm gonna add a little bit more detail because it's a little bit too ambiguous for me here. There's more relief in there. Like I said before, you have a curved surface, so I like to play up my lines and my shapes so it looks like it's coming over a curved area. Some stuff goes in, some stuff is raised. Now some of these little shapes you've made with the template, you can work on them a little bit, bring them out a little more if you want. Okay, one thing I touched on earlier was that I like to keep the focal point in the center, keep it bright. As you come around here, you might not have seen it before, but as you come around this wing, it sort of disappears. It fades away into nothing. And I accomplished that by, if you remember before, with the opaque whites, fading them away, and then now I'm bringing it back in with the tones I'm using now, transparent maroon and that mixture. And it gives it an illusion of that it turns into a ghosty kind of effect. Now, to work in this area here, I'm staying real far back and I develop the shapes like I normally do. And as I see them start forming, I capitalize on anything I see that's kind of neat. But I don't want to give it too lumpy a look. I want it to stay fairly flat looking. Once again, don't be afraid to add maybe some more veins. Don't get caught in a trap where everything you have to do with your airbrush is tight in. The airbrush is effective in a million different ways. It's just a matter of stumbling across them. I find every job I do, I find something new that I can do with the airbrush. If you keep that in mind, every day it's a learning experience. You know, you'll never know all the things you can do with an airbrush because it's just kind of a tool that has so many variables in it that you can always develop your skill to a new level. And that wing's looking pretty good. Before I actually start pulling out some of the shadow areas, I'm going to give this thing a light wash with a warmer tone because I want this thing to end up being very, very hot looking. The reason I'm doing the wash first is because sometimes when you do a wash, even though it's incremental, it does knock away some of your detail. So try and do your washes beforehand. I've got like a really light, transparent yellow in here, and that's going to help pull all these colors together later in the long run. Even though it's very, very subtle, it just warms everything up. I'm going to leave some of the areas that are closest to the light almost white. Other than that, I'm going to take this whole piece and push it towards the warm spectrum. That way it's all going to kind of be in the same family when I'm done. It's really just a matter of preference. You just keep your eyes open, take a look, adjust it. Now here's the beauty of these transparent colors now over that pearl white we had earlier, is that every tiny little layer you put on top is going to be amplified tenfold. You'll see later as I go out darker into these areas with some oranges and some reds, eventually it'll all just kind of all tie together and draw your eye to the center of this piece. He's already starting to look a lot warmer, because I did add some cool colors to my transparent maroon just to get the darker effect. Okay, as I'm washing, you can see that the distance from my airbrush is probably, I guess, 8 inches to sometimes even farther back, because I want to get a real gradual buildup of color. You got to let it spray in the air when you do this, so you want to make sure you're wearing your respirator. The color I'm using for this particular wash is PPG's equivalent to House of Colors Candy Intensifiers, and it's a DMX 210, and it's mixed with 895. It's a color blender, and that is the same as House of Colors SG 100. It's like a lockdown type clear. What I mean by that, it's almost like a clear base coat that just kind of keeps everybody joined together. I'm not going to get too crazy down here because I'm going to probably add some funky color there, so I'm not going to nail that too much, but you start to see the dynamics here. Just turning the heat on, that's all. I'm just developing these colors very slowly. You can't just get in there and wail away at it because you get streaks and blotches and you don't have the control. So I'm satisfied with that color right now. We might come back in, wash again, I'm not sure, but right now that's as far as I want to go with the yellow. Okay, now I'm going to go in here and start developing the shadows. I've darkened up my original mixture by adding some purple, a bit of green, a couple of drops of trans-oxide yellow. And I think I got something that I can work with here. So I'm going to pick a dark area and I'm just going to see how this is going to develop. And this is a good time now to take a look at it and see if you need to reevaluate the color you've chosen. In this case, I like it already, so I can continue to work with it, but it's a good time to sort of take a look at it. I guess, you know, you could go in here with some highly reduced black, but I prefer not to. I'd rather mix up a darker shade of the original and steer away from that color. Now, just like the rest of the mural, just build it up slowly. Now's the time you can start adding a little bit of detail in shadow areas. Keep in mind you're trying to work on the very darkest areas now and slightly wash over everything else, but retain some of that original color. See how it pushes that jaw forward? Now use the same technique all around. Keep your eyes open for development of uneven areas. Make sure even in the dark areas to make some interesting forms. Or else just have big, empty, black shadows. Or dark shadows, and that's no good. Use those same color in the shadow underneath the creature. I like to leave a mist of the original color on the outer edge of the shadow. Gives it a different, just a little more dynamics. Okay, we're going to cut this guy out here. Okay, it's time to move on to his face. I'm going to start pulling out some details. So I've reduced my paint a little bit more again. There's going to be a lot of air going on, not that much paint. I'm going to find a dark side and test my color. Probably the jaw area. I'm going to see if I can pull that out a little bit more. It is possible to get very, very dark areas without using the black. Like under his jaw here. It's approaching full saturation of a very dark tone, even though it's not, it contains no straight black. If you look at your color wheel, purple is the darkest color in comparison to everything else. It's almost like a black. To me, it's like a black. So by using purple or muddying up your original colors with its complement colors, you can get darker tones. Put a little in here just because I want this to stand out a bit more. If you don't have control of the color and it goes on too thick, you can't get those fine transitions that look so convincing. It's easy to overwork something. So take your time, build it up. You want to hit inside the crevices. You don't want to get this dark color on the outside. It won't look right. Now, when it's reduced this much, if you keep working the same area for a while with getting too hot in one area with the reducers, you're gonna make a little white hole. Don't trip out too much because you can just blow it back in, but if you really dig in and you're not careful, you can make a mess. Lots of air, lots of air. Far edge can be quite dark. After all this work and layering and layering and layering, there's a certain point in a mural when it starts to really take form, really get some depth, and really start to look like it's going to come alive. I'm going to put some hair in here. I've added some more of my original mixture to thicken it up, and I put a little more purple in there so I can build up the tones faster. But I'm just using dagger strokes. Everybody is familiar with that. I think most strokes originate from the dagger stroke. Now, in the beginning, I said not to worry about this horn area because after the hair goes in here, it's going to pop out, and it does. So you just keep the tones building, building. Go where you're going to go, and then just keep these dagger strokes going backwards. And when we underpainted the hair, don't hide all those little strokes we did originally because that'll give it some more dynamics here when we're done. Now, when you get into an open field like here, concentrate on the look of it. Get some of your finest strokes here, because that's where people are going to be looking. They're not going to see these fine strokes in the mass of the hair. They're going to see them on the outskirts, just like I did in the wing. Just little tiny, small eye candy that lends itself to the idea that you've got this control of your airbrush to a point where you can lay down pretty well any line you want. People love tight work. Now, since every stroke I put in here straight, I'm going to put maybe one that's not, just to break it up. Good, that gives them a pretty cool hairdo there. Okay, now I notice as that darkens, now you can control other areas and balance them out. I like to deepen this up a little bit in here, just at the bottom. I'm pretty satisfied with his face. I'm not going to mess around in there too much more. Once the highlights go in there, I think he's going to be pretty well completed in there. It's really easy to overwork something. So continue on and pull out areas that you want to pull out, push things back. There might be a shadow in here because of this horn. It doesn't necessarily have to be seen as a shadow that conforms to the actual horn. It's just a dark area in there. So that's cool. Moving on to the wing area. Even though it's in a lit area, I want to give it a bit more dimension. It's a good time to do that. It's okay to have soft lines too. The best way to check that out is just look around you. Not everything's a real tight, hard edge. It's different shades of things. It's just enough to bring it out. On this side, I suppose I'd like to bring this forward, so I'm going to work one tight line here and blow that color back and bring my hair right up to the edge. reversing my direction so I don't stroke into and over the wing. It gives the appearance that it's going behind the wing. The direction of your airbrush is whichever way you hold it. If it's going to be straight on or if it's going to be to an angle slightly each way, really impacts the type of strokes you can use. I generally very seldom hold my airbrush exactly perpendicular unless it's really tight stuff. I like to hold on an angle and kind of work away. You'll notice I always hold my hands together unless I'm into a real soft area, but I really like to feel that familiar feeling of control wherever I am. It's almost like you're one giant piece and your shoulders work rather than your wrists, you know, kind of moving. And I think what I'm going to do, since I have this color in my gun, not because I'm lazy, but because it'll make a good local color, I'm going to go into my rocky type texture formation at the bottom of the tank and work with this color. That way it'll be in the same color family but a totally different tone, starting darker. Okay, going in with my darker color now, I'm going to start to enhance this little landscape. A lot of it's going to be covered up later with painting that's going to be going over top of it, but we need to have something to paint over. Now, when I'm doing this type of stuff, I just kind of enhance whatever's already there. And always make your crack flow with the general shape. Where I come from, there's a place called Craig Leith, and it's amazing. It's got this shale landscape, and the way it peels away, it's like layer after layer of these skinny little sheets. And that's what I sort of see here, you know, layers and the funny textures that I see there. A lot of times what you see during the day or wherever you are on a holiday, you really pick up on that stuff too. Another place that's got really cool rocks is in Sturgis, South Dakota. There's a place called the Badlands there, and it's like something from another world. You almost expect to see the Roadrunner or something pop up there. Generally, see how you just sort of build up layers, darken this up. Like we did at the top, as you get farther away from your detailed surface, kind of just fade it in. All doesn't have to be super tight. I can see there's going to be a hole here. Now, as we get over the lip, that's easy to see. No rules. Only rule would be to try and keep, if you want to call it a rule, is try and keep your lines working with the same shape of the rock. Keep them all going the same way. Keep in mind your light source. You don't have one light source for one area you're painting and another light source in a different area. So try and keep it consistent. There's such a thing as counter light too, so not everything has to be in darkness everywhere, but even though that's true, you still have to keep consistency throughout your piece. This one's more towards light, less shadow. This one's away from the light. Dig in a bit. Now, like I said, this can be painted over later, slightly. So don't spend a lifetime in here, but give it some interesting areas. Just work the areas just like you do with everything else. When I do little skulls, I don't like to make the whole eye completely dark. Looks like Roy Orbison sunglasses or something. You want to leave that bottom area for some reflected light. Light's coming this way, you can give him a shadow under his teeth. At the bottom of his melon right here. So, work that in there. Maybe there's an indication of how this guy met his demise. Maybe he's got a little bit of hair left, who knows. Okay. So I think you get the idea of this rocky part. I'm going to continue on here, develop this area more, and then when I come back, I'll show you where I ended up. A little bit thicker mixture. And add a little bit more purple to it, just to give it a bit more contrast. Here's that stencil I was talking about earlier. You can just kind of use your imagination with these texture stencils. It gives you these linear, weird shapes. You can give them a crack in there. It's just something new and something that your eye can look at that's completely different from your other strokes. And then you can enhance them, marry them together if you'd like. So they look like they belong there, but the cool part is that they're different from everything else. There's another one I made that's got like a bunch of little tiny holes in it. Good for making a little kind of specky area. I like to start with a tight line at the top where the edge would be. darkest shadow would be in there. And then move back and start developing some form. Now, once again, we're getting away from the focal point of what I'm working on. So I start to relax on the detail and I get a little looser. Just giving it the idea that it's a place for this guy to hang out and live. There's a different piece on our texture stencil, but it gives you a nice little piece to play off of. And it looks like you spent time doing that, but you probably, if you at a time, it's like about 3 seconds to make that cool shape. I like that so much, I'm gonna do it again. This time I'm gonna reverse it though. Actually, I'll use another chunk of it so it's completely different. Just remember where you're spraying though, where your overspray is going. You don't want this going to the top lip. And away you go. Instant texture. Let's try it over here, I'll show you again. And then just play off it. It looks like, you know, you took the time to cut a mask or you did something, but it's quite convincing, really. So this pretty well concludes this area. I'm not going to get too much more involved here because of the fact that we're going to start putting little screaming meanies coming up through here. So remember, dark to show light, so we're going to darken this up a little bit, but not lose all the detail we did in there. Okay, I've got some transparent red in here. I just want to shift this guy between the local colors, the secondary local color, right on the edge of it, and lay in a little red. It just makes like a secondary kind of tone that I can play with in here. And it just accentuates the yellow wash that we did earlier. So really, at this point, you probably might not even be able to pick this up, but it's a very, very subtle change. I'm gonna really get into it in here, where I've got my shade and shadow, because I want to knock it back, but I don't want to lose all that semi-detail we have in the shadows, the luminousness of the shadows. Now, the extremities sometimes have redder casts to them. I'm just going to go around and do it to places where I think it looks right. Anywhere that looks a little pale and frail, like his tail, add that in there. Always throw a little bit into your bottom areas just to tie stuff together. Doesn't have to do a lot, just enough to shift the color sort of towards that area. Okay, now we've got some transparent maroons, straight up, not mixed with purple or anything. It's very a reddish color. I've worked in the flames, the top, the tips, and you can sort of just kind of knock in some details of them. Here's a part where I could make a tip come up. Maybe it'll go right inside his wing. I want to make this outer area be a reddish color, so your eyes get drawn to the center of the piece. Then we'll take orange and a rainbow effect and start building it towards the center. Enhance some of the flames, but I want to keep them quite subtle. So I don't want your eyes to come away from the piece we've worked so hard to build in the center. And look at it now, this purple, it's a little bit more away from the central tone that I want. So I'm just going to nail it with a little bit just to kick it to that side of the fence. Just look for areas that lend themselves to a flame-like pattern. You'd want to wear a respirator in this stage. Okay, at this point I'm going to come back in here with some transparent orange, which you can get off the PPG mixing bank. It's equivalent to House of Colors concentrates. So I told you about this one before. You mix it with $8.95 and it's like almost like a candy color. Now I'm going to knock back almost like a rainbow from red to orange into this light yellow on the flames. Places where you feel it helps, put a little orange into the guy, but don't lose all your lighter yellow tones, just for harmony's sake. Stuff's going on behind them, so you might want to maybe just put a couple of streaks through in the direction of everything else. Same with the top on the outside here. Continue that illusion of drawing the eye towards the central area. It's okay at the bottom to overlap because you want to marry everything together down here. I'm going to lay some on the other side. I don't want to get too close to him. I want this to almost stay almost a whitish tone. He's kind of a screaming dude. This guy's in a world of trouble. Now don't make this guy compete with your other image. Just very slightly. And then you can play up some of the darker areas of the shadows of the flames and where the orange would be. He's got his arm in there, so work that in a little bit. Inside the flames, you can sort of just play them up a little. To get close to the bottom, I want to make it darker, just because it looks right. Seems to look like the right choice in here, so they go together nicely. I like some of that orange in here too. I'm going to knock this wing back a little bit by putting some orange in it. It's just like when you did the wash earlier, just keep adjusting it until you get that rich tone that you're looking for. Really now it's just about kind of looking and seeing what looks right in your eye. Keep going until it looks right. And I think that's good. I like that. Okay, I'm going to go back in here now with some white. It's reduced to a point where it's not going to spit on me, and I've got a little bit of orange that was left in my airbrush, and that's going to keep that white looking like it belongs to be with the rest of these hot colors. Now I just want to bring some stuff into the foreground in order to give it the illusion of depth. I like sometimes to make flames just appear out of nowhere, because if you ever look at fire, some of them seem to have no origin. They're just coming out of thin air. For artistic license, I'm going to keep these fairly bright and fairly white in front of here. Reason being is I don't want them to compete and fall back into the dark tones of the rest of the piece. In these areas, we can start to make suggestions. Okay, as you can see, I'm coming to near the end of this piece. It's going to be great. I'm excited. There's only one thing left to do here, in my opinion, and because white is inherently blue, I'm going to start knocking some of this stuff back with yellow, a little trick I learned from my friend Terry Hill. So I'm going to lightly touch this white with yellow just to knock back that bluish cast that it sort of gives. I know it doesn't look that blue, but it really makes a difference when you start to just get rid of some of that. It all kind of looks like it lives in the same family, and it doesn't look so harsh. Even out here, although with the DX colors, the transparent colors, even if they're mixed with 895, just like I find with the House of Color stuff, the candy intensifiers, when you spray the white over them, unless you clear them first, they tend to bleed back in and lose a bit of their harshness. Now, same with here. I'm going to really play up this yellow area. Now you can get in here because it's transparent. It'll knock down any type of overspray you had. And here, in the face area. Just be careful though. Just enough to get rid of that tinge of blue it has. It's a real good idea to wear a respirator at this stage, because whenever you're spraying from a distance, it's really going everywhere as well as on the tank. I want it to be really hot right here. So that's a focal point. I'm going to drag people's eyes right to this spot. Slowly but surely, pick it up. And that all kind of ties everything together. We kind of come full circle, and that's it. I'd like to thank PPG for providing all the paint for this video. I've used their products for years and I love them. And to you, Jesse James and West Coast Choppers, for a great piece of steel to shoot. Thanks for watching. See you next time.